University oral examiner. My name is Ray Levitt from the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering. And for those of you who don't know what the external examiner is, it's somewhere between a quality audit external and a referee to make sure the process is fair to the candidate. And so I'm not expected to play a technical role in the process, but I am the timekeeper and the university official in charge of the exam. So I've known Somik Raha for some while when he was a research assistant for me a number of years back, developing some software and writing a user manual based on making falafel, as I recall. And I see the food tradition continues. But in any case, he's going to do his PhD oral exam. And so we'll say 45 minutes or so for the presentation, 15 minutes Q&A, and then we'll switch to closed session for the committee. So welcome all of you. Thanks for this great turnout, and we look forward to your presentation. Please hold questions except for clarification questions till the 45-minute presentation is over.
Thank you everyone for making the time to my dissertation defense talk. The title of my dissertation is Achieving Clarity on Value. And you have in your seat a supplementary handout. The supplementary handout will have, can you hear me now? So the supplementary handout has some distinctions which, just in case I go a little quickly over the top, you can refer to it. So I'm going to start with 3 questions for the audience. As a decision maker, what do you care about, why, and how much? And do you know how to go about answering these questions? So this has been the focus of my exploration, more so the first 2 questions and a little bit on the third question. More formally, the research problem I'm looking at is that people have difficulty identifying and communicating what really matters to them and why in the context of decision making. To tackle this problem, I'm drawing from 3 domains. One is sociology, second is philosophy, and the third is decision analysis. And the solution that I hope to propose is to clarify sources of value, and to be concrete, there are 3 contributions. The first is the use of ethnography from sociology to discover embedded values in culture. The second is the use of formal axiology from philosophy to appreciate sources of value. And the third is the creation of value diagrams to communicate sources of value. And all of this is in the context of decision making. So the agenda for the talk is that I'll motivate the research questions. Then, as I mentioned, the 3 contributions, I will go into each of them at length on discovering, appreciating, and communicating sources of value. Then I'll talk about achieving consistent valuation, and then extend the value conversation, and finally conclude. So I'll start with the research question. So some of you may have seen this map if you've taken a class in decision analysis. These are the 6 elements of decision quality. So here we see a stool, and the 3 legs of the stool are alternatives, what we can do, information, what we know, and preferences or values, what we want. And the seat of the stool is the logic that ties the 3 together, and all of this sits on a frame. And the last element of quality is commitment to action. And of course, the most important thing here is the person sitting on the stool. Without the decision maker, there is no decision to be made. So I'm going to be focusing in this graphic on the preferences, the values leg of the stool. And my broad research question is, how can we help decision makers get clarity on value? Now, value is used in 2 ways in decision analysis. In the first one, we ask the question, what do you care about, in the hope of discovering attributes of value. So the decision analyst will use this in the noun form by asking the question, does this prospect have direct or indirect value for you? Now, the people who study value in philosophy land, they are called axiologists, and so they are hearing the question, what existential value do you find in this prospect? The second kind of question that we ask about value is, how much do you care? And the decision analysts use value in this instance in the verb form. How much do you value this prospect relative to other prospects? And the axiologists are hearing, how do you value this prospect to establish trade-offs? These are 2 very different uses of the word value. So the focus of my dissertation is on the first one. Does this prospect have direct or indirect value for you? And what's the nature of this direct or indirect value? Can we shed some light on this? So within this, I'm going to unpack the question on clarifying value into 3 components. How can we help decision makers discover, appreciate, and communicate sources of value. The motivating problem that I will use through this talk is what I'm calling the SUDPS schedule problem. SUDPS is the Stanford University Department of Public Safety, or the police department. And the decision question here is, what is the best officer schedule for the police department? Now, this picture that you're seeing here is that of a decision diagram. And I will not go too much into this in the semantics of the diagram, but you will see on your handout on page 3, if you're seeing this for the first time, how, what the different components are. But this was a probabilistic model that I built with some friends in a class in probabilistic analysis in 2006. And this is a queuing theory model, and what you're seeing here is a retrospective decision diagram, which was made after the fact. This was implied by our model. So the rectangle here is the decision, the schedule, the best schedule that we could come up with. Then this is an uncertainty, so calls for immediate service. Another uncertainty is the service times of other calls in the queue. So immediate service is calls which are of the nature of an emergency. So somebody is in trouble and needs help. It's usually a life-threatening situation that the police have to respond immediately. Now the police can only respond if they are free and if they're not handling other calls. So that decides if the call will be diverted, and by diversion, I mean that there are neighboring police departments. So if the Stanford Police Department cannot take the call, it'll be offloaded to Menlo Park or Palo Alto, and one of them will respond. So when we did this model, the implied valuation was on the attribute percentage of calls diverted. And while this is easy to critique, my intention is to go into a deeper reflection and use this as an example to see how we might modify the value node. How might I model this or unpack this node and see it in its full richness? So I'll use this as a problem that runs through the rest of the sections that I'll introduce. So with that, the first one is discovering sources of value. So many methods contribute to discovering sources of value. In the field of decision analysis, they come from the field of consulting. And the most common one is iterative questioning, where you keep asking people, what do you care about and why? And you keep digging deeper and deeper until you can go no further. I won't go through all of the methods, but two pretty important ones are asking the decision maker to describe desirable and undesirable prospects. That clues us in on what they really care about. In this mix, I would like to propose the use of ethnography as a methodological contribution to discover the value that's embedded in the organization culture. So I'd like to introduce the method itself a bit. So most research methods that tend to be deductive have a process where you ask a question, read the research, design a study, collect data, organize it, analyze it, and then form an answer. Now, ethnography is a little different. We start with designing the study, collecting data, organizing, analyzing it, getting the answer, and then asking the question that best fits the answer we have, and then looking at the other research that's out there. So in that sense, it's an inductive method of inquiry, not a deductive method. It's particularly suited for studying culture, and the key difference between deductive methods and this is that the hypothesis comes at the very end. So the ethnographer is really a social anthropologist who immerses himself or herself in the culture for a long period of time and discovers what that culture values. So this step is particularly interesting, where after we've got a lot of data in terms of transcripts, we write it down, we read the data lots of times, we write memos to ourselves, then we do what's called coding. And coding is finding of patterns in the data, themes, and seeing how these themes relate to each other. And after doing that, we are able to make some propositions and see how they fit with the rest of the data. That's what I mean by forming an answer. And then we try to come up with the best question that fits the answer that we already have. And then we see how it fits with descriptive frameworks that other people have already come up with. So when we compare this to other approaches, I could just ask the police, well, what do you care about? And they would say, well, public safety enforcement, which they did. Now the critique is a decision maker may not be able to articulate what they really value. So I could also read descriptive frameworks that other researchers have come up with. So now the police department at Stanford is private in the sense that it's funded by Stanford University. At the same time, it's also public because it's deputized by Santa Clara County. So it's kind of a hybrid model. The criminology literature on private policing says that private police tend to be more proactive than reactive. They also tend to have a client focus. The sociology literature on public policing starts off, or is pretty much led by this famous paper by John Van Manen, where he argues that the police in a public department get their identity by keeping bad people off the road. The only ethnography I was able to find of private policing was of the agency Intelligard in Canada, and the author John Riegekos, he argues, he takes a Marxian filter where he reduces the cultural interactions to economic ones and argues about the commodification of public safety. So my critique here is how much of this applies to our police department. And so my goal was to figure out what does the police department on campus actually do, and what can we infer about their values from a holistic perspective, taking everything into account, their actions, their words, and their history. And so the results, so this was after doing several hours of ride-alongs, interviewing some of the founders of the police department and the current police chief, and looking at a whole bunch of documents on newspapers, doing a lot of field work for almost a year. And the result is, yes, they do care about public safety enforcement. They are proactive, but there's a slight difference, or there's a big difference actually in client focus. So traditional private policing literature says that the police care about the people who pay them. But Stanford Police defines client as anyone they deal with, including people they arrest. And they use that as a reason to treat everybody with dignity, including those who are being arrested. The third and big difference here is, is compared to the sociology literature, that unlike the public police departments where they see their role as keeping bad people off the road, Stanford's police department sees their role as an educator. And this can be explained by a lot of the sociological theory that's out there, that people acquire the values of the organization they are embedded in. And so the Stanford Police has acquired the value of education by virtue of being on campus. So in summary, we've discovered sources of value embedded in the organization that I didn't know starting out. So if I were to look at this diagram and do it from scratch, I would have put public safety in it, but having done the ethnography, I would add education to it. Now you notice the question mark. I still don't know how these two relate to each other, so we're still continuing our exploration. So as a summary for this section, ethnography is a methodological contribution when focused on uncovering value in the culture. And in particular, in the police case study, we realized that we need to factor the value placed on education, on being proactive, treating everyone as clients, a whole bunch of other things that we discovered in the ethnography, in any decision model where value is important. But there are some questions that still remain. How do these values relate to other values? So with that, I'm getting to the next section, which is appreciating sources of value. By appreciate, I'm using it in the sense that Merriam-Webster defines it. So appreciate is to grasp the nature, worth, quality of, or to judge with heightened perception or understanding. And as far as I could tell, the only method in decision analysis to do this is iterative questioning, which helps us discover direct versus indirect values. To this mix, I would like to propose the introduction of a framework from formal axiology to classify the experience of value. Now, before I explain the framework, this is a graphic which many people who've taken decision analysis are familiar with. So we have thought and we have action. And decision analysis is the intersection of thought and action, which we call actional thought. So we're really after clarity of action. But before we go there, we need some clarity of thought. So this section is about clarity of thought. And the framework that I'm importing is called formal axiology. It comes from the work of Robert Hartman in the 50s. There are three distinctions on value, three dimensions of value that he defines. The first is intrinsic value, which is valuable in and of itself. Second is extrinsic, which is instrumental. It's a means to an end. The third is systemic value, which involves concept fulfillment, construct fulfillment, any rules, laws, or ideologies that are fulfilled. That's at the level of systemic value. Now, the way I've been able to understand this for myself is, and this is how I'll import it into decision analysis, is that intrinsic relates to identity, and it deeply affects who we are. Extrinsic relates to prudence. Something is good for us because of some story we have told ourselves. And systemic, it relates to systems, things that are artificial. These are systems we've created to manage our world better. So we are reducing our world simply because it's too complex. Now, systems do have prudential value. It's prudential to have a system. But a difference between prudential and systemic value would be, say, brushing our teeth is prudential, but brushing our teeth in the morning and night is a system we've created in order to get the value from dental hygiene. Another example, valuing life of a soldier killed in Afghanistan from the perspective of the commanding officer of the deceased soldier. So at the level of identity, the commanding officer may have lost a friend or colleague who simply cannot be replaced. You do not even know where to begin describing the value. At the level of prudence, the commanding officer has to deal with bad press, morale, informing the family, sending replacements, and recruiting more troops, a lot of practical actions. And at the level of systems, he's going to report the number of troop deaths went up by 1. So there are three very different levels of looking at the value in this prospect. Now, I'm not going to defend this framework for what it is because my focus is more in decision analysis. How can we use this for making better decisions? So what I am going to do is to use these 3 categories to generate questions that can help us uncover sources of value for a decision maker. So as an example, the first question can be used to ask, how does this prospect relate to who you are? And this can help us get to intrinsic sources of value very quickly. So from this point on, I'm going to use the word intrinsic and identity interchangeably. I found that different people relate to one or the other of the words. Prudence is, how is this prospect good or bad for you? And systems, what are important constructs, heuristics, or metrics that are pertinent to this prospect? Now, as an example, not as a proof, but really a demonstration, in a project with the Parking and Transportation Department, I built a big strategy table. And a strategy table is basically a list of all the decisions you can possibly make and the interconnections between these decisions. And so after doing this for over 3 weeks, when we had pretty much exhausted everything we could come up with, I asked the 3 axiological questions. And the person I was helping said, well, from the third question, the systemic question, said that, wait a second, it might be very useful to measure the bike miles traveled from people off campus because we could convert that to carbon offsets. And so carbon offsets could be a source of value which we could trade in the carbon market to fund the bicycle safety program. So whether it's feasible or not is an entirely different question, but this was something that got put on the table because of these questions. We'd missed out on this. So moving on, let's go back to the original model that we were looking at. So let's forget about the ethnography for a moment and let's critique the attribute that I had come up with initially, which is percentage of calls diverted. And the logic behind percentage of calls diverted is that if it's better to have more calls taken on campus than have them taken from outside because the chance of harm will be higher. So if I ask the question on intrinsic values or identity values, in the police department, what prospects affect you at your core? And the police chief says, well, it's public safety and it's officer safety. And under public safety, we're prompted to ask some further questions. Well, is it really true that the disvalue of the calls that are diverted is the same magnitude as the value of the calls taken? In other words, taking a call is good, but diverting a call is worse because someone from outside will take a much longer time. So there should be some more penalty for every call that's diverted. And that's not clearly represented in this value node. But a much bigger critique is, what about quality of resolution, the people hurt? That's completely missing from this attribute that we've chosen. Now on the officer safety side, what about the number of officers hurt? That's again missing from this value node. At the level, so one other point I'd like to make here is that when we talk about direct values in decision analysis, I'm proposing that it should have some connection with our intrinsic and identity values. And I'll show how I bring this in through some later case studies. At the level of prudential values, the question might be, what about this prospect helps us achieve our goals? What behavioral aspects of material assets are related to this prospect? And so the chief might say, well, courteous behavior is very important. Work-life balance is important. So for instance, if our officers are overworked, then that will affect the quality of resolution. And somehow there's no connection between the schedule and the effect on people working overtime. And that should be there in a more holistic decision model. The third one, public safety education, is a huge source of prudential value because education, the police chief believes, it helps increase people's awareness and people's ability to keep themselves safe. And so the question then is, are we investing enough in education? So education is a source of prudential value. It could also be a decision to be added into the scheduling decision. Are we keeping time for educational activities? At the level of systemic values, what are rules, metrics, or heuristics that are related to this prospect? And the police chief says, well, safety in numbers is important, so she has a rule right now that there should be at least 2 officers on campus at any given time for officer safety. So this is really not represented in our model, because we're treating the number of officers the same, regardless of how many they are. But if we were to do this again, we might want to model a higher chance of a worse outcome if the number of officers drops below a certain number, say 2 here. She says we're also limited by budgets, and that's an artificial systemic constraint that we have to worry about. So in summary, I asked the police chief to critique the value node without any structure, and she had a hard time. She missed officer safety. So she got most of them, it was a bit of a struggle. But then when I showed the axiological questions in the categories, it was very smooth, and she was able to get all of the different sources of value. Now, for someone who's been doing decision analysis for 3 decades, this may not be a big deal, but for the rest of us, it really helps to have a structure for the value conversation. And the goal really is that we want to get all the important value attributes because we want to make a good decision. So with that, I'm going to move to the next section, which is communicating sources of value. Now, we can tell value stories right now with the current nomenclature. And this is from Professor Howard's paper, Foundations of Decision Analysis Revisited. So here we have an environmentalist in Africa who fundamentally cares about wildlife, where wildlife is the direct value and tourism is the indirect value. So tourists are important because they affect wildlife, either by raising money or by creating trouble for protecting wildlife. Now, hotel operator, on the other hand, in Africa says, well, tourism is really my direct value, that's my business. And wildlife is a good idea because that's what people come to see. So these are 2 very different value stories. I'm proposing a new notation called value diagrams to tell much richer value stories. So here's a 3-barred arrow, a thick arrow, which I'm calling the identity arrow. And this person, the environmentalist, says, environment affects my identity, and wildlife is fundamentally important to me for that reason. And a 2-barred arrow is a prudential arrow. So tourism is prudential for wildlife. Whereas the hotel operator says, hey, tourism, I'm just doing it for money, and wildlife helps bring people and I can make more money, so it's good. But then there could be a third kind of hotel operator who says, wait a second, tourism is fundamentally important to me because I love bridging cultures. I love helping people see new places and understand other cultures. And so this is a part of my identity. This is who I am. And wildlife is definitely prudential to tourism, but this is really at a different level of value. So there's a very different value story compared to the previous guy who just cared about it for money. And we can show these stories now. A quick caveat, these diagrams are not solvable. So for some of you who might be thinking about relevance diagrams or decision diagrams, they come with their own set of rules, but this is not at the level of systematization, so it's not systemic. Again, we're after clarity of thought, not yet into clarity of action. Now, you could also introduce systemic values into this. Systemic values are rules, laws, or things that are black and white, things that pass the clarity test. So, for instance, visa regime, which regulates how many people can come in. And that's a constraint on our thinking. And I'm going to recognize this. Anytime you put a systemic value, that diagram I'm going to call a constraint value diagram because it constrains our value thinking. Other common constraints might be budgets or FDA approval, things like that. Next, I'm going to introduce a canonical value diagram. And these canonical diagrams, they are those diagrams where it's only the identity node that goes into the final value node. And this is, of course, not canonical. The intent behind this is to force the discovery of underlying values behind prudential and systemic sources. Now, I'm not claiming that this is the way it must be drawn, but I am saying that if we try this, we might help decision makers find the ground that they're standing on. So I'm going to ban the systemic arrow going directly in, and for any systemic value, you have to find the underlying prudential value that gave life to that system. So what is that prudential source of value? And for a prudential value, it has to connect to an identity source of value. There are more rules which I can share during Q&A if you're interested, but these are the most important ones. So a quick meta comment is that identity value is a declaration, no proof is needed. And a typical sign of you having reached this is that you can't answer why this is important to you. Prudential value is an assertion, and systemic value is a constraint. There's another characteristic of identity values which I will share more towards the end. let's go back to the police case study. And so here's the police chief's value diagram, where she cares about harm to people on campus and harm to officers on campus. Now, just for the sake of brevity, I put a negative sign. Otherwise, I would have to say avoiding harm. So that's the only notation I've added on. Public safety, education, and awareness is a prudential source of value, and budget is a systemic source of value. Now, this is not in canonical form, so let's move it into canonical form. This matters because it reduces the harm to people and officers. That's why education is important. Education is also important because there's another underlying value which the police chief shared, which is she doesn't want to be coercive. So in a menu of options, the police would like to take the least coercive option possible to maintain the people's safety. So really the police are trading off between coercion and harm. Let's focus on budget. Now budget underneath it is police resources. And police resources help you develop or invest in education and awareness. Now, if we go back to the ethnography, you will remember that education had become a part of the identity of the police. So the question may arise, shouldn't there be an identity arrow from public safety, education, and awareness to the value node? And the police chief says no, because this is purely prudential. If somebody convinces me that education is not going to help keep people safe, I'll stop doing it. Then we realize that there's actually a separate node on education. This is the goal of Stanford University, which the police shares. And this is at the level of the police chief's identity, where education is important. We are here. In fact, if this node were not here, then we should spend all our money on protecting people from harm. But because this is here, we have a trade-off between investing in education and keeping people safe. So these are the fundamental sources of value, the intrinsic or the identity level sources of value. Let's go back to the police scheduling problem that we were looking at. What we've really done is we've unpacked the value node. So there's all this discussion going on, which is pretty much opened up for us now. So in summary, just as decision diagrams are a visual language to develop clarity about a decision, value diagrams are a visual language to develop clarity on value. And there are some extensions I've done with science, which I'm not going to show in the interest of time, but you're welcome to ask them during Q&A. Moving on to the next section, which is on achieving consistent valuation. So a quick comment on this is that we want to be consistent with our deepest values, and that's why I mean consistent valuation. And I'm going to take a much simpler decision problem than the scheduling one, just to make it just as an illustrative example. So let's look at an undergraduate helmet safety program. Now, for many of you who know, Stanford undergraduates don't like wearing helmets, and when they fall down from their bicycle and hit their heads, it's a very bad outcome. So the question is, should Stanford fund an undergraduate helmet safety program? Now, we know how to model this arrow. So this is an arrow on the cost of the program. We also know how to model this. This is the distribution of undergraduate head injuries. And we can also model the influence of this decision on that distribution. Now, there could be a whole bunch of other nodes in between, but for simplicity, I'm just collapsing it to one. But my interest is in this node here, as in how do we flesh out the head injuries? And so the bigger research question is, how might we draw a decision diagram to be consistent with the value diagram? And I'm showing one example. So start with the value diagram of the president of Stanford University. The CFO also has a very similar diagram, where he fundamentally cares about education, and trauma to the individual is a negative source of value, so is coercion. Prosperity in the university matters because it helps with the goal of education, and resources expended affect the prosperity. So let's take this, and this is the unpacked value node of this decision diagram. So let's look at resources expended. That is going to be represented as the cost of the program. Prosperity can be subsumed into cost, and I will also subsume education into cost because cost is already a negative value. When we are spending on things that are not education, we already are accounting for a penalty there, so I'm not putting a separate one in. Coercion of others, well, if the Stanford administrators say, let's put a citation if you're not wearing a helmet, or let's just ban bicycles for all undergraduates, then you will never have head injuries. Well, sure, you can do that, but then you'd have to model a coercion disk value. Do you really want to be coercing people? Why? Because the president says he doesn't like coercion. Okay. Trauma doesn't really connect with the alternatives, but it will come up in this one. So we're going to repeat this process for the uncertainty, undergraduate head injuries. So resources expended becomes cost of treatment. Prosperity can be subsumed into cost. Now education would be, well, you lose time for your education. We care about education. So there's an education time loss disk value. Okay. What about trauma to the individual? Well, so there's a trauma disvalue, and this is separate from the cost of treatment. This is saying that if insurance covers all the costs, don't have to put up a dime. We'd still want to put some money on the table to not have our undergraduates getting into serious head injuries. So there we have now come up with a decision diagram with functionalized value nodes. And I'm going to just focus on these functional nodes for a moment. And to keep it simple, I'm going to assume that Stanford's not going to put any money for education time loss. Let's just assume it's 0 for now. So the summary of this is we've basically incorporated intrinsic functional values into this, and cost of program, cost of treatment are prudential, whereas trauma disvalue is directly formalized from the intrinsic or the identity source of value. And so for this, you're never going to have data. This is your willingness to pay, your willingness to put your money on the table for what you care about. So underlying this are the two fundamental sources of value. So cost is bad because it affects education. You can't spend as much, so is cost of treatment. And trauma disvalue is trauma to the individual. So we're really trading off two direct values, education and trauma. And the value attribute here is just one, which is profit or dollars. But it's not profit in and of itself. It's profit pegged on top of education. And that to me was the big clarity I got by doing this model. So I can show the results of this model with the numbers if you're interested during Q&A through the helmet safety program. I also did a couple of other case studies. One was an alcohol safety program at Faden, which was on very similar lines. Also did a car insurance model for risk management at Stanford, and a senior citizen safety model for the trauma center at Stanford Hospital. And I'm happy to share the results with any of this if you're interested. Now let's go back to our motivating problem, the Stanford police schedule. So we unpacked it. Now if I were to do this all over again, I might remind you that I had mentioned quality of resolution a little while back. So I would definitely put some node called quality of resolution into this diagram, and there'll be a whole bunch of other nodes going into it. But for now, to keep it simple, I'm just going to focus on how we might value the quality of resolution. So here's the unpacked value diagram of the police chief, and which has harm to people on campus, harm to officers, education, and coercion. Now, quality of resolution, if I look at harm to people on campus, I would want to check number of traumatic outcomes to the public, and I would associate a trauma disvalue with that. For officers, I do the same thing, number of traumatic outcomes, and I put it into trauma disvalue. Where it gets into education, so education matters because of cost. So number of traumatic outcomes in officers has a cost element to it. That's the money we're taking away from education. And so also for the public. Then we have education time loss disvalue. That's this arrow here between harm to people and education. So when people are hurt, they're not spending time on their education. And so the education time loss is important, and we value that because we said so. And the coercion disvalue, if there is any coercion implied by this, I would model that. So this is how the functionalized diagram would look. And when I say functionalization of value, this is precisely what I mean, that the final value function in this node has some connection with the intrinsic sources of value, the identity sources of value. So, and just see it in a graphic form, each of these values matters not in and of itself because they're sitting on top of something more fundamental. So we've incorporated things we care about. Next, I'm going to take a step outside of decision analysis and go into a broader domain to extend the value conversation. And the goal here is to create mutual understanding on value frames. And by value frame, I mean that which is behind the value diagram. Just as the decision diagram is not the decision, the value diagram is not the value frame. So the goal is to create this understanding in organizations and in political conflicts. So for the first one, for organizations, wouldn't it be cool to find out what our employees think we care about? And so I did this case study with the police chief and two of her lieutenants who just joined from another department. We drew the value diagram for these lieutenants of their previous police department and their current police department. And the question we asked was, do you know what your boss cares about, to the lieutenants? And so I'm just presenting a small snapshot of the results, where one of the lieutenants said, well, I don't want harm to people. That's a fundamental source of disvalue. People served is good, and coercion is bad. And enforcement of the law matters because it lowers the harm to people, and coercion also has a prudential link to people served. Now, he thought the police chief's diagram was very similar, except that it had an identity arrow from enforcement of the law, and it was missing an identity arrow from coercion. So I asked the police chief, well, what do you think of this? And then she said, well, I know where he's coming from. And she said that enforcement matters not in and of itself, but for reasons of equity. And this is something that she's been trying to emphasize in the department, that any student on campus should be treated at the same level as anyone from East Palo Alto. And that's the value here, which we now have articulated. And she also clarified that coercion has an identity link for her. She would prefer the least coercive option possible in their decision making. So what we just did was we facilitated the understanding of organizational values. Now other applications so I tried doing the Dalai Lama's value diagram, and another one with the US-Iran standoff with a very senior US official from the previous administration. And outside of the political space, I also tried to draw value diagrams of the major world religions. So in the interest of time, I'll just show one of these. In the political space, the question was, do you know what you care about? Do you know what the other side cares about? And do you know what the other side thinks you care about? So this is the Dalai Lama's value diagram from the perspective of a Han Chinese subject who grew up in Southeast Asia. And so for him, the fundamental sources of value for the Dalai Lama were Tibetan independence, continuation of the Dalai Lama institution, Tibetan Buddhism, and returning to Tibet in his own lifetime. And diplomacy was very important to the Dalai Lama because it would help get independence. Western democracy he supported because it helped him be a better diplomat. So this was the Han Chinese perspective. My comment on that was, these three nodes seem to be systemic values because they're pretty clear that they're systems, but this one seemed to be a deep source of value, an intrinsic source of value. So I tried this with a Tibetan subject who was an envoy to the Dalai Lama and knew him really well. So he said, well, the Dalai Lama fundamentally cares about expression of Tibetan identity, expression of Buddhism, and expression of world citizenship. And economic and cultural freedom matter because they affect these two, expression of Buddhism, Tibetan identity. Nonviolent action is important because it helps promote economic and cultural freedom. Nonviolent mindset is important because it promotes nonviolent action. And that is also important because then the Tibetans can start to accept Chinese rule. And that was very important because it connects with the expression of world citizenship. And it also connects with, so it could trigger Chinese compassion. And if Chinese compassion is triggered, all of these three will be protected. Another important source of value for the Dalai Lama is coercion. So the Dalai Lama is fundamentally against pushing people or making them do what they don't want to do. And so nonviolent action it's going to reduce the coercion in the situation, so also Chinese compassion. And the Dalai Lama keeps emphasizing that he wants the Tibetans to benefit from the strength of the Chinese. So I showed this to the Han Chinese subject. And so he said, wait a second, economic freedom does not really lead to expression of Tibetan identity. And here are a long list of comments, I'm just sharing a few. He says the Uyghurs are very entrepreneurial, but not the Tibetans. They're laid back because of their religion. 20% of them are monks, and so it's very bad for production. Now, just to understand where he was coming from, I'm going to show a small snapshot of the subject's own value diagram. And in it, he had development of Tibet as an intrinsic or an identity source of value. Production was good for development, and monastic culture was bad because it lowered the production of society. So I showed this to the Tibetan subject, and he said, well, actually the monastic education and culture promotes more peaceful and compassionate actions within society. And this is the basis of ethics and positive education. And so he said, I'm aware China is all about booming development, but are they enough for the stability and long-term health of a society? But the story doesn't end there. So I went back to the Han Chinese subject and using the supreme power of the canonical value diagram, I said, well, wait a second, development cannot be an intrinsic source of value because you and I both are able to agree that there are a whole bunch of reasons why it's important. If we can tell why it's important, it's not fundamental. So we've got to go deeper. So after a discussion, we came up, and it was a remarkable moment when this happened. We realized that what he really cares about is the well-being of everyone within China. And the way it turned out is that the word nation, when you bring it into Chinese, these are the two Chinese characters, it's guojia. And guojia, when you translate it back into English, is nation family. And so the Chinese, they view the concept of nation as a family, and hence this might help explain why they have extreme reactions when people are trying to interfere in the idea of in their notion of a nation, because they see it as family interference. And really, so then it's a very deep positive sense of value for at least for this Han Chinese subject, that well-being of everyone in that family. And the bigger meta comment that I have in this is when he discovered this, that it was not development that he was after, but the well-being of everyone, there was a moment of silence. And there's a famous quote that the smaller truth has words that are clear, the greater truth has greater silence. That's another. So in addition to the intellectual test that you can't explain why something is important, there's another test that the harder people are finding to communicate what they care about, they're getting closer and closer to what really matters to them. So that would be another practical test. And I have a little more time. So another thing I'll mention is that this subject, when we were having this conversation, he had come prepared to scold me for not being sympathetic enough to Chinese position. But after this shift happened, where he discovered the ground he was standing on, he tells me that I wanted to scold you, but I can't. And we just had a very deep sense of understanding of what he cared about. So what's the value of figuring out the ground on which we are standing? And how do you communicate the deepest source of value without silence? So I still don't have answers to those questions. So to summarize, what we've shown is that ethnography has helped reveal embedded sources of value in the organization culture. Formal axiology helped us understand why value sources were important and to elicit more sources of value, to critique value nodes, and to give us filters to interpret the ethnography. The value diagrams have helped us communicate value frames, move toward achieving consistent valuation, to promote mutual understanding and communication, and to gain clarity on polarized value frames. And the specific context of the police example, we started with percentage of calls transferred. When we discovered the value of education through the ethnography, and in the appreciation phase, we added a bunch of other values, officer safety, public safety, and other ones as well. In the communication phase, we unpacked what was inside the value node, and finally, we showed one way of resolving the decision diagram. The future research questions that we might add, so in the field of decision analysis, we might ask, well, how might we formalize the conversion of a value diagram into a decision diagram? So I've shown one way in which I've done it, and the closest I could get to formalization was that the intrinsic or the identity sources of value must have some representation in the direct values. But beyond that, others could find other ways of making a smoother transition. Another question is, how do we continue the value conversation to help us systematize the relationships between functional values? So by this, in many of the case studies, the final value function that I used was additive, in the sense I added up profit and the education disk value, everything was added. But is that necessarily the case? As in, when would I move from an additive to a multiplicative function, or a step function, or some other function? And can we get some clues on what that function should be from the value diagram? Or can we figure out some other way of doing this and representing this on the value diagram? Now on the sociology or the culture side, one thing I noticed was that people tend to make other people's value diagrams very simple while making theirs very sophisticated. So is this really a general result, and why do they do this? And another question there is, for one person who's moving through organizations, I found that some part of the value diagram changes while other parts of it remain constant. So it'd be pretty fascinating to see which parts change and what's the pattern in that. And as a broader result, the value diagram could be a way in which ethnographers might report their results as far as values of a culture they're exploring. With that, I'd like to thank everyone on this page who has helped me. And I just don't have enough words. Everyone in this room has helped me in such a significant way. In particular, I'd really like to thank Police Chief Laura Wilson, who's here with us, and so also Ariadne Scott from Department of Parking and Transportation, and the other Stanford administrators in Baden, Stanford Hospital, who really helped me do the case studies that gave me the insights I needed. So thank you so much. Thank you for coming.
So we can open it up to questions from the audience. I'll let Somik manage the question.
Yes?
How do you know when a value diagram is complete and when it needs further development?
So when you stop drawing. So it's an elicitation tool, and the two things I noticed was there's an expansion and there's a contraction phase. So initially I want all the value sources, and the interesting part comes when we start doing the relationships and get into the canonical form. That's when a lot of the intrinsic values drop off, and it turns out that they're just prudential. So that's one of the trends I've noticed. And it's no different from decision diagrams, because the same question applies to decision diagrams when you stop drawing. So I think the principle that can guide us is, this is Professor Howell's paper, we're after cogency and not verisimilitude. In other words, we don't want to model the world like it is, but we want the most powerful thoughts about the world that can guide our actions. So that's another, so the value diagram is not in and of itself, but as focused in a decision context. So that helps scope the diagram as well. Yes?
I mean, I think this kind of can reframe a lot of things in corporate America, specifically. I mean, right, so CEOs always think about maximizing shareholder value, which I guess according to the framework that you applied is a prudential value, not an intrinsic value. So how would you think of applying,
All right.
in a for-profit framework?
So you could get a better person than Adam Smith for this. So I'm going to read something from Adam Smith. So this is perhaps the most misinterpreted statements, set of statements from Adam Smith. Whoever offers to another bargain of any kind proposes to do this. Give me what I want, and you shall have this which you want, is the meaning of every such offer. And it is the manner that we obtain from one another the far greater part of those good offices which we stand in need of. It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest. We address ourselves not to their humanity, but to their self-love. Now, the problem with this whole passage is that people interpret this in an extreme manner, that this is an exclusive, this is the only situation which is true. I don't think Adam Smith is saying that. I think it's much closer to what Dan Pallotta says in his book, The Uncharitable. He says the fallacy is that the for-profit sector does not help people. If we shut down the global oil conglomerates tomorrow, we would soon find a world in need of a great deal more help than it is in need of today. If not for the for-profit electric companies, we could not power any of our charities. Helping people is what the for-profit sector does. The for-profit sector simply doesn't regard the presence of self-interest as being at odds with meeting need. Indeed, it regards the two as essentially connected. And so I think the broader comment on this is a huge problem in the for-profit world, where we are forced into a very narrow conversation on value, whereas the truth is most people I've met in the for-profit sector are there not to make money, but to do some great act of service. In fact, a simple example in the Stanford context was I was having this conversation with Arndt about teaching assistants. And so he said, well, teaching assistants, we get our salary. And I know that Arndt, if somebody catches in on the road and says, Arndt, help me with this problem, a student says this, Arndt's going to stop and do it. And he's not going to count how much money he was paid and whether he's crossed that amount to do the service. At the same time, he's not going to go to the department and say that, hey, I'm having such a great time doing this service. Here, take your money back. So we have both. And I think a holistic perspective needs to account for both as integral. And I think pegging the value of profit on top of something more fundamental might be one way of resolving this problem. Yes. Okay, so this question is on slide 96. So Pancho is asking, as citizens of the world, what do we do when enforcement of the law, like now in Arizona, is in a flagrant misalignment with the identity value of human dignity? Well, I think one start could be to draw a value diagram for the people who are making the decision and find the ground on which they are standing. In fact, my biggest learning from the Chinese case study was that I had to really control or protect myself from judgment, and I was getting very close to it. But with the power of the canonical value diagram, without lecturing this person, without saying anything negative, and without judging, this person found his own deepest value. And it was so inspiring for both of us that we were in a different space. So I think there's a better way than lecturing others, and maybe these tools can help us step outside who we are and look at our values with some distance and separation. Maybe that might give us more clarity. Yes, Linda.
Just going back to the previous slide that you had up with the quotation from Pallotta.
Yes.
I just wanted to ask whether his comment about the for-profit sector being there to, that we'd be in trouble, say, if we got rid of the oil conglomerates, doesn't that take for granted that the present system is going to stay in place? But, you could have a system that's bad. You could have a family where the parent is a drug addict and dealer, and they bring in money and they feed their children, and they say, well, if this person stops selling drugs, their kids would be in trouble. But am I missing the greater depth of Pelota's stand here? He seems to take for granted the existence of a system which may or may not be beneficial.
So I think there's a deeper comment here, and I think the deeper comment, one has to invoke the Buddha for such things. So the Buddha says that nothing is good or bad. And so if you look really closely, you will find that every system, you can do no harm without doing good, and you can do no good without doing harm. So even in the drug situation, I mean, a lot of if you really look at why there's so much drug violence, why it wasn't there earlier since it has been continuing on, and part of the reason might be the clamping down on the enforcement of making it illegal. And there's a lot of theory in this, in that when you try to control things, the prices shoot up, and that's why it's so profitable. But if you could just buy it like a pack of cigarettes, nobody would care. That's one school of thought. So there are a lot of arguments, and it's not so cut and dry. At least that's my perspective, that there's no system we can design that is going to help us reach our values. In fact, that's one of the reasons why these distinctions are so important. Anything we're dealing with at the level of decision making is prudential, but the only way we can realize it is in the matter of systems. But systems, we've really reduced the richness of value. And so having this separation can help us develop a bigger distance from our systems and not get emotional about any one system. Every system is going to have its flaws, and it's up to us. I'm not making a comment or a judgment that certain systems are bad or worse. I'm not going to defend that. But the bigger question is, how much distance do we have from our systems? Are we guided with a reflection on the deeper underlying values that we're standing on? That would be my interest in answering. As in, if I were to deal with people in these systems, I would ask them that question: what's your value diagram, and have you thought deeply enough? Can we help go deeper? Yes, Ray.
How do you aggregate these diagrams? And let's say there's a jury, and each one has its own value diagram. Each person. How do you aggregate those?
So I'll have to fall back on decision analysis. So there is no such thing as an objective decision. If there was one, then political science would vanish. Marriage counseling would not be necessary. So it's an unsolved problem, and it cannot be solved. But a group of people can come together, agreeing that we will act as though this is our common value frame. So that's where the organizational value diagram becomes very useful. So when the police chief shows her value diagram, it may not be the same as every individual in the department, but they can choose to agree, saying that we will act as though this is our own value diagram, or we will, now that we know it, we can reflect and decide, is this consistent with our values, and if so, that guides our decision making. So in that sense, there's no objective thing, it's just a choice that we make. Yes, please.
Somik, so do you have a sense, going through examples and so forth, under what conditions is it really important to get down to the intrinsic level of values, and in what conditions is it maybe not quite as value add?
You mean in decision, so
Well, so I think of the sensitivity analysis. When is it worthwhile going through this effort?
Great question. So I think the best I can do is show an example. So this is a senior citizen safety model for Stanford Hospital, the trauma center. And so we did the value diagram. They had the same set of values, which is kind of I made a comment on the ethnographic process that once we found the value diagram of Stanford, many administrators said this works for us. So we had the Farewell to Falls program, and this program has a cost. And what this does is they send people out to senior citizens' houses and make sure they don't have any sharp edges. If they fall down, the damage is not too much. So we had the success of the program given the investment. We had number of minor fall injuries, which led to an emergency department cost. Then you could have hip injuries and head injuries. So hip injuries led to hip replacement cost, and head injuries had a trauma cost. But both had this intrinsic functionalization, the injury disvalued. And so the way that worked out was, after putting all the numbers, we could do a sensitivity analysis on the intrinsic values. So the cost of the program was $180,000. So this says that if Stanford is willing to spend at least $50,000 for hip injuries and nothing for head injuries, they should say yes to the program. This is the benefit to cost ratio. And on the end of head injuries, they should be willing to spend at least $100,000 to prevent one senior citizen head injury. And if there's somewhere in between, they could be here. Now what we could also do was say, what if we took part of the money from insurance, Medicare, and only part of it from Stanford? So we lowered the ask to $80,000, then it becomes much more reasonable, where if Stanford believes that they're willing to pay at least $10,000 for both a hip and a head injury, they should say yes to the program. So you can have, in fact, this is the kind of discussion which I think would be very interesting, where we've taken all the data we have, but finally we get down to the space where data isn't going to help us. That's where we are trading off on our values. How much money am I going to put on the table because I care about these?
So one thing that comes to mind when looking at the diagram is how real it is, like how truthful and being when drawing a value diagram. So have you done an analysis of this is your value diagram and this is the decisions you have taken in, let's say, last 5 years, and try to do some coordination of how, like what the relationship between these two. If there's no relationship, that means you don't understand your values, for example, or you don't act according to your values. That might be another conclusion.
I think that's a great research question especially for the sociologists or people who are interested in culture to continue with this. That we could try. It would be pretty fascinating to see that, especially in the political arena. Let me show you.
You started all the questions.
Slide 5011.
So this is, this is the Iran situation, US-Iran standoff, and this is from a decision maker pretty high up who will be unnamed in the previous administration. And so democracy was a fundamental source of value for this person. World peace, democracy is important because it helps world peace. And then there was this one, giving legitimacy for bad actions, which is a big negative. And then there was effective decision making. So legitimacy for bad actions sets a bad example for others, and that's bad for effective decision making. But how do you know which action is bad? It's very problematic to have this kind of a node which has a prejudgment on what is good and bad. And what is even more problematic was that democracy is a system, but it has intrinsic identity value. And I tried pushing this person, and so in the conversation, what it turned out, so the question I had was, well, there has to be something under democracy, A, which is important because of C here. What is A and C? And from my interpretation of the conversation was this person was thinking of safety of external freedom. And external freedom itself is what was fundamentally important, which is why democracy was important. And I think that distance is very important. Because that distance isn't there, we end up making decisions that can violate this value. And that's the space you don't want to be in. If you have that fundamental source of value, you don't want to be inconsistent. Ultimately, the judgment, the question that you're asking, it's really not me judging someone else, but it's that decision maker saying, here's the ground I'm standing. I don't want to contradict that ground. I want to be consistent with it. Yes, Chris?
Your value diagrams, I think, is a very useful tool in making explicit the unspoken values of a person. Part of it is to help clarify what those are to the person herself. The other part you mentioned was to communicate it. In the case that the person does not want to make explicit those very values that he or she possesses, just from a practice viewpoint, I was wondering what thoughts you may have to help this process along.
So you're asking what happens if the person doesn't want to bring it out?
Like in a negotiation, you don't want to disclose the true value.
So if it's really about tackling disingenuity, so there's only one kind that I could help with, that the person is confused and we can help them get towards clarity, but if they really don't want to reveal it, I don't think there's any tool in the world which can help. Any management science tool that we bring up, it has that assumption in the frame that this person is going to be truthful about telling me what they want. Otherwise, my tools aren't going to help very much. So that's the broader level question. But generally, I wonder what would happen to the whole negotiation frame if people started out with values. And that to me is, let me show you another one. This is from the world religion. So the political one, the Tibetan, the Han Chinese was so different. But the political one, yeah, the political one, the religious one was so surprising to me of how similar they all were. And so, for instance, this one from Hinduism, the fundamental sources of value. And so, a monk who's actually in the room here, who I interviewed, says his big source of value is holistic clarity, seeing things as they are, and purity, as in bringing that clarity into daily life and increasing their purpose, resolve, determination, and living in unity is the fundamental value. Right? That was Hinduism. I'm going to skip through this. This is a friend who I interviewed on Islam. And look at this, living with presence. Living with awareness is important because it helps live with presence and being. And we get into this space where words don't do it anymore. So he says, well, please put the Arabic, because I don't know, there's no English equivalent of this. But the closest you can say is being. Also, the 5 pillars of Islam help with being so that it helps with living with presence. Now, let's go to a rabbi. And she had realization of the first commandment, which was living with God for her. And again, everything else, don't covet, was another a central value because it helped with everything else. But finally, it boiled down to living with that presence. And a reverend who, this was again about the 10 Commandments, and again at the fundamental level, it was relationship to God, relationship to others. And when I showed her the rabbi's diagram, she said, yeah, we're talking about the same thing but with a different language. So if we, in a negotiation, if we were to discover that the ground we're standing on is fundamentally the same, we might have a much easier time talking about the smaller truths. So that would be my response to it.
So,
yes.
Would this have helped the church, Catholic Church is going through crisis right now?
I think I find it more useful for individuals to reflect on this than organizations, because every organization is, at the end of the day, a systematization, and that's at the systemic source of value. So for an individual to reflect on it, that distance between the system it helps us get more gold from all the other systems that exist. Understand their limitations and see that, hey, they have some gold in there, and in spite of the limitations which I don't agree with, let me take the value which is existing in it. So I would much rather people think that this is empowering enough for them so that they'll always live as rich individuals. Wherever the value lies, the intrinsic or the prudential, I'll take it, no matter what system it comes from.
Well, if we wait long enough, we'd finally get to a question for which you didn't have a pre-prepared slide. And so, very fascinating, very thought-provoking presentation. We'll take a 10-minute break now, and then we'll continue in closed session. Thanks to all of you for coming.
If you didn't get to ask questions, there's a feedback form at the end. Please feel free to drop it.